I'm Claire. If you're watching this, then use this as your reminder to go get vaccinated. And if this is your first time here, then all you need to know for now is that I have no clue what I'm talking about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Today, we're going to be talking about the Golden State Valkyries. But this is actually going to be a bit of a different type of video, because while I was looking into the Golden State Valkyries, I kind of fell into a little bit of a rabbit hole, and so I'm going to talk about it. I started writing the script for this video back in October, around the time of the WNBA finals. Today it is actually December 6th, so we've been procrastinating, which is just the theme of my life. But at the time that I was writing the script, I was getting pretty hyped for the Valkyries, the new expansion team. But I was also realizing that I had not watched a single WNBA game in my life. And so I tuned in to the Lynx and Liberty facing off in the finals. And honestly, it was a lot of fun. Very entertaining product. The two teams put up a really good fight against each other. It did go all 5 games, which is always fun. And, now I'm just really excited to be a full-on bandwagoner, to get on the WNBA train and get hyped for some games. But I also did have to come to terms with the fact that apart from a few of the big names, Caitlin Clark, Asia Wilson, Angel Reese, Brittany Griner, Sabrina Ionescu, and Diana Taurasi, I don't know much about the WNBA. I actually don't know anything about the WNBA. Before writing the script for this video, I only knew of 4 WNBA teams, and 2 of them were the ones that were playing in the finals. The 3rd was the Fever, and the 4th, frankly, was the Valkyries. I didn't even know how big the league was, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I don't know much about the WNBA. And more than that, I realized that I have a huge blind spot when it comes to women's sports in general. As much as I love sports, I just don't pay attention to women's sports. And at that point, I had to ask myself the question, why? The simple answer to that question, I think, is that women's sports just aren't as popular in the United States, or anywhere, as men's sports. And if I wanted to, I could just end the conversation there and get to the part y'all actually want me to talk about, which is the Valkyries. But I do think there's an opportunity to look deeper even here. Why aren't women's sports as popular as men's sports? One prevalent argument that I actually kind of used to subscribe to is that women's sports just aren't as entertaining as men's sports. Why watch the Women's World Cup when you can watch the best in the world battle it up in the regular World Cup? Why watch the WNBA when you can watch the best players in the world compete in the regular NBA? The WNBA doesn't have Steph Curry or LeBron James or Kevin Durant. But I think in that argument we encounter a bit of a fallacy. Sure, men and women play differently. Their physiologies are different, so their styles of play are naturally also different. And again, you could argue that because their physiologies are so different, women's sports are going to be inherently less entertaining just because they play differently from men. First of all, I think that's a little reductive. Just because they play differently doesn't mean they're less entertaining. But let's, for a second, take gender out of the equation. Let's focus just on physiology. And We're going to choose a bit of an unconventional sport, but one that I hope gets my point across. And we're going to look at men's judo. Not a sport that many people talk about, although it does have its very devoted following. But let's take two of what I would say are the greatest judokas in the world. In men's judo, in all of the weight classes, only two men, have ever won 3 gold medals. The first to do it was Japanese judoka Tadahiro Nomura, who won his medals in 1996, 2000, and 2004 in the below 60 kilogram weight class. The second to do it was legendary French judoka Teddy Riner, who won his individual gold medals in 2012, 2016, and 2024 in the over 100 kilogram weight class. So already we've got two very differently sized guys. One much smaller judoka at below 60 kilograms and one much larger judoka at, I believe he's at 140 kilograms, so nearly twice the size of Tadahiro Nomura. But even though Teddy, at nearly twice the size of Nomura, is both bigger and stronger than Nomura, no one would ever dare compare these two judokas. Not only that, but no one would ever claim that one judoka is more entertaining to watch than the other. Both judokas are entertaining to watch on their own merits. Their styles are different. Obviously, their physiologies are different, but they are equally entertaining to watch. Both are, you could argue that either one of them is the greatest of the sport, and definitely they're both the greatest of the sport in their weight class. So, if we would compare these two men of very different physiologies, why are we comparing men and women? They have different physiologies, yes, and their styles of plays are different, but why does that make women's sports inherently less entertaining? And I would argue it doesn't. Are they really that much less entertaining, or is that just what we've been led to believe after centuries of ignoring women's sports? I think a big part of the narrative surrounding women's sports stems from the gender roles and expectations of our collective past come to haunt us. For centuries, women have faced barriers entering sports. In the Victorian era, for example, women were discouraged from playing sports because people believed that playing sports would harm their reproductive organs. And if women did participate in sports, usually wealthier, whiter women, they were pushed towards more feminine sports, like tennis. That might explain why women's tennis is much more popular than other women's sports, and why women tennis players are paid much more than other female athletes. They just had a head start on everyone else. But you'd think that as women fought for more equal rights, sports would follow naturally. After all, women fought for the right to vote and earned it, so why didn't participation in sports follow with that? It's possible that between the right to vote and the right to have your own bank account, sports might have taken a bit of a back seat in women's rights issues, which is understandable, bigger fish. But whenever progress is made, there is always backlash. It does not matter what the issue is. With any social or political, even change, there is always going to be backlash. It could be as simple as, for example, a church changing from pews to chairs and facing immense backlash in the congregation. Or it could be people getting upset that universities are starting to provide women's sports programs, like we saw in the 1920s. In the 1920s, 22% of universities had sports programs for women. But after some backlash, that percentage decreased significantly by the 1930s. That time, I think the claim was that women get hurt easier than men, which is kind of funny now that a few more modern studies on soccer players has shown that women are much less likely to fake their injuries on the pitch than men. Having watched Italian soccer, I am readily willing to believe those claims. This pattern of progress and regression is common across history, and specific to today's video, common in the history of women's sports. You saw it with the university sports programs of the 1920s and the backlash in the 1930s. And then you saw it again with the little step forward with the industrial baseball leagues of the 1940s, when all of the men were off fighting a war either in Europe or the Pacific, and the only people that were left to play baseball were women. And then you saw, and even if you would have hoped that those leagues would survive post-war, unfortunately they didn't. Women went back home, and all of the factory baseball teams dissolved. Or the women's teams. The men's teams, I assume, stuck around. So that's definitely one disadvantage that women have had in trying to popularize women's sports. There's been much more of a struggle for women's rights, and there were more important things than sports. But I think there's something else that popularized men's sports at a much more rapid pace than women's sports, and that would be television. By the 1950s, just a little after the women's industrial baseball leagues had all dissolved, 3/4 of the United States owned a television. And while sports had been broadcast on televisions for, I believe, a decade before, because televisions just weren't as popular, they weren't broadcast as widely. But in the 50s, all of a sudden, sports were reaching a much larger audience than before. And since there weren't any women's leagues, people were watching men's sports. Men's baseball, men's basketball, men's football, men's sports. And that opened up a whole new market. People who had previously not been interested in any sports suddenly could tune in to a game happening hundreds of miles away. And they could grow their interest in that sport. And so now, here's my controversial take of the night. I think that if women's leagues had existed in the 1950s, when televisions were becoming commonplace in the home, I think that women's sports would not be nearly as far behind as men's sports in terms of popularity as they currently are. Because with a wider audience, women's sports would have more of a generational fan base like baseball, basketball, and football have. On top of that, the rising popularity of sports in the era of television proliferation led players to being more highly paid, to having more control over their own contracts, and thus to having more of an ability to focus on the sport they were playing, and thus refine their skills and develop their talents to make their product more entertaining. It used to be that, let's take baseball for an example, because that's what I know more about, but it used to be that professional baseball players would have to have a second job because baseball paid peanuts, and they could not make a living off of being baseball players. And then suddenly, in the 1950s and onwards, you're seeing players getting big contracts, players being able to have a single job as a baseball player, and all of a sudden, the sport's getting really exciting. And if women's leagues had existed around the time of this proliferation of television, there's a chance, a slim one, that women would have had that same opportunity to become popular, to get control of their contracts, be paid more, and then focus more of their time refining their skills and becoming better players, and thus, as loath as I am to use dehumanizing language, more entertaining products. So now we get to modern times, and we get to explore the implications of our past on our present. And unfortunately, I think our past does still weigh heavily on us. Even today, women and girls are less likely to participate in sports as men. For example, I remember one time when I was visiting family in France, and the son of my mother's friend invited me out to go to a soccer match, just a spontaneous pickup game. And it was a burning hot day. It was like 90s, getting close to 100. It was hot. And, that's what I told him. I told him I think it might be a little too hot to go playing today. And he looked at me and he just told me that he had assumed that I wouldn't want to play, that I would just want to chat with the other girls on the sidelines. Or, maybe that's too old of an example. Right now, I am on a recreational softball team. I'm not very good. I have some definite weaknesses. But I'm a valuable member of the team because in our co-ed league we have rules around female participation. We have to have 3 women if we want to field a full team. And we have trouble scraping together 3 women week to week. If one of us is sick and can't come, the team's in trouble. And we're one of the teams in the league that has the most women. So it just goes to show you that we're still struggling in that respect. But on the other hand, that's just my personal experience. I could be in a bit of a bubble. France is not particularly well known for its feminism movements, and I live in an area that has a lot of young men, and probably more young men than it has young women. So let's look nationally. Let's look at professional women's sports. There are a total of 11 professional women's team sports leagues in North America, representing 7 different sports. Of those, only 3 leagues, the WNBA, NWSL, and PWHL, pay their athletes a living wage. Essentially, women's sports now are where men's sports were a century ago. The athletes, not the Caitlin Clarks, but the other ones, the regular ones, are fighting for livable wages. Occasionally they have to balance their professional sports careers with jobs that actually make them money. And they often have to train in less than ideal training facilities. That being said, I don't think it's going to take us a century to get women's sports to where men's sports are. I think it'll take us a while, but I don't think it'll take a full century, because women's sports now do have an advantage over men's sports back then. The WNBA and the NWSL both have broadcasting deals with major networks. I want to say ESPN. And then Unrivaled, coming next season? Next season. Also has a broadcasting deal with ESPN. There's also an upcoming softball league, the AUSL, that also has a broadcasting deal with, again, ESPN. ESPN is kind of getting a monopoly on women's sports. We'll see how that works out, but at least they're broadcasting women's sports, and that's a win for ESPN. But for the WNBA and the NWSL especially, the exposure that they're getting means that their players are going to have better tools to advocate for the wages and facilities that they need to hone their sport, which means that their timeline for becoming as entertaining a product as their male counterparts is probably a lot faster than men's sports were about a century ago. Especially with the WNBA, and we're finally circling back to the actual topic of today's video. Especially with the WNBA, we're seeing rapid growth and development. That's honestly very promising. Since its founding in 1997, the WNBA has seen consistent growth, actually. It's small growth. It's definitely not near the popularity of the NBA, but it is seeing growth. The league went from 8 teams to 12, and this next season, 2025, they will be adding a 13th team. Very excited for that. And they're expected to get 2 more expansion teams in, I want to say, 2026. Viewership of WNBA games has increased pretty consistently since 2016. And if my dad's former paralegal is to be believed, they put on an incredibly entertaining product. Maybe even more entertaining than the NBA, according to my dad's former paralegal. He said that 5 years ago, it took me 5 years to see for myself. And I've only seen like 3 games, so I'm not convinced, but there's a lack of sample size there's a lack of sample size. I can't believe I'm only now getting into it. I really should have listened, but it's really hard to get into it when you don't have a local team. And I wasn't about to go rooting for the Aces. Nor did I know the Fever existed at that point. Interest in the WNBA is definitely growing. They have a good product. And they have some exciting players. I mean, look at all of the hype around Caitlin Clark. That woman almost single-handedly carried her team to the NCAA finals, and she had a very good rookie season. I may not have watched the games, but I know how to read stat lines. And the interest in the WNBA is translating into higher wages, not as high as I think is fair, but higher wages, better training facilities, and more opportunities. And that's not to say that the athletes aren't still facing challenges. They definitely see more sexualizing and demeaning comments than their male counterparts. But some definite progress is being made, and that's really exciting to see. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's talk about the Valkyries, because I am hyped. I am very excited to get on this bandwagon. You know, even though I've only watched, again, 3 games of the WNBA, I really want to do well. I want this team to succeed. I want to win a championship in the first year. Do I think that's possible? Probably not. Like I said, today is the expansion draft, and while I don't know who we're going to draft from the other teams, I have a feeling that the Fever are protecting Caitlin Clark. Didn't Google it to confirm it, but I just assume. But hopefully whoever we do pick will be a solid start to a good team. Right now, I'm just going to assume that the people in charge are picked well. Really, really hope they do a good job. I need this team to succeed. Mostly for my ego. But if you can tell at all, I am very excited for the Valkyrie. I've obviously already got the shirt. I got my mom the shirt. We've already got plans to go to games. We're excited. And we're not the only ones. There are a lot of people in this area who are hyped for the Valkyries. I mean, pretty much as soon as the team was announced and the logo was out and everything, they also had merch out because we are in a capitalist nation and of course they're going to make money off of it. But people were buying the shirts, buying the sweatshirts. You can't go on a walk around here without seeing someone in Valkyries gear. People are just excited for it. Helps that the logo is pretty awesome, in my opinion. And I'm a big fan of the name. I think it's a good pairing to the Warriors, frankly. You know what? Let's just call it as it is. Valkyries killed it on the merchandising and the marketing. And even though, as I speak currently, by the time this video is edited and uploaded, there will be a team, but as I speak currently, even though there isn't a team, I feel good about this team's prospects just based on the moves they've made already. They're taking this seriously. This team isn't going to be an afterthought. Consider the facilities. The Valkyrie are being given their own locker rooms, their own well-designed, kind of gorgeous locker rooms at Chase Center, and they're getting their own facilities in downtown Oakland, which is bringing jobs to Oakland and new infrastructure to Oakland, and frankly just seems like a win-win for everyone, including the players who get their own brand new facilities to train in. As for the team itself, the Valkyries poached Nikasi from the Aces. Aces have a pretty good recent history, so that's a move that makes me kind of excited. Hopefully that's a good omen. And, again, we're going to be getting a team today, December 6th. But since we're the only expansion team this year, hopefully that means that we won't have too much competition. I think it would be very hard to have any competition when we're the only expansion team participating in the expansion draft. I really hope they don't screw this up. But, again, it's very unlikely that the Valkyrie will be able to draft the likes of Caitlin Clark or Asia Wilson. I think all of the teams will be protecting their big superstars, which just means that the Valkyries have to draft their superstar in the regular draft. I'll be honest, unlike the 2024 draft, I had no clue who the top pick for this year's draft would be just by casually scrolling social media. It wasn't too hard to find. It is Paige Buckers, who will be going to the Dallas Wings, almost undoubtedly. I hope she likes Texas and Heat. But now that we know who is getting the top pick of this year's draft, let's talk about who the Valkyries will draft with their 5th pick. Based on various mock drafts that I looked at while researching this video, the Valkyrie could draft one of the following people: small forward Anissa Morrow, point guard Olivia Miles, shooting guard Azzi Fudd, shooting guard Sonia Citron, guard Tahina Papau, and or center and presumably the tallest French woman in the world, Dominique Malonga. Now, the French in me is hoping that the Valkyries draft Malonga. She's a very promising player, and I want a French woman on our team. The exciting things about Malonga are that she's young. She was on that Olympic French team, the women's basketball team, who did win silver medal in the most recent Olympics. And that's no small feat. However, first of all, I do not think that a team in its first year of drafting for a brand new team would pick a center. I would also be concerned about Malonga's age. She is just a teenager. She's 19. And she might not be WNBA ready. Honestly, I don't think she's a 5th pick. Let's just put it that way. I think she'll go in the first round, but much later. That being said, as much as I would like the Valkyrie to pick Malonga, just because of my ego as a French woman, as a Warriors fan, I am well aware of who owns the team. And even though the Valkyries have a completely different organization, these are not the same people making decisions, the Warriors love their guards, and I have a feeling the Valkyries are going to love their guards too. In the last 5 years, the Warriors have drafted 7 guards in early picks. That's Joe LaCobe's team. And there's a good chance that'll translate to the Valkyries. It's hard to shake the feeling that the Valkyries will follow in the Warriors' footsteps and draft a guard early, which means that I guess we'll be welcoming Sonia Citron to the Valkyries soon enough. On the other hand, what do I know? I have no clue what I'm talking about, especially when it comes to basketball.